Hey guys, tonight we're about to shatter one of history's most persistent myths, that the entire Middle Ages was a dark, cold, miserable period where everyone lived in filth and died young. What if I told you that for nearly 300 years, medieval Europe was actually warmer than it is today? Picture this: English monks tending vineyards in Yorkshire, Greenland covered in actual green pastures, and Vikings sailing freely through Arctic waters that are now permanently frozen. It sounds like fantasy, but it's documented history that most people have never heard of. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up in the year 1100 AD, and the first thing that hits you isn't the smell of unwashed bodies or the sound of plague bells. It's how surprisingly pleasant the morning air feels. The sun is warm on your face. Birds are singing, and if you didn't know any better, you'd think you were in modern-day southern France, not northern England. Welcome to the medieval warm period, or as climate historians like to call it, the medieval climate optimum. And yes, they actually use the word optimum, because compared to what's coming later, these 3 centuries were basically Europe's golden age of weather. From roughly 950 to 1250 AD, Europe enjoyed temperatures that were consistently 1–2 degrees Celsius warmer than today. Now, I know what you're thinking. Big deal, 2 degrees. But here's the thing. In climate terms, 2 degrees is absolutely massive. It's the difference between thriving civilizations and complete societal collapse. It's the difference between Greenland being green and Greenland being, well, what it is now. During this period, you could grow grapes in England as far north as Yorkshire. That's like successfully running a winery in modern-day Alaska. Archaeological evidence shows that vineyards stretched across the English countryside, producing wine that was actually exported to France. Imagine the audacity. The English were selling wine to the French. It's like Americans trying to sell tea to the British, except it actually worked. The Vikings, those supposedly brutal raiders, were actually taking advantage of ice, free Arctic waters to establish trade routes that would make Amazon's logistics network jealous. They sailed freely to North America, established settlements in Greenland, and treated the North Atlantic like their personal highway. The Norse settlement in Greenland, which we'll talk about in devastating detail later, supported over 5,000 people during this period. They raised cattle, grew barley, and lived surprisingly comfortable lives in what we now consider one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. But here's where it gets really interesting. This wasn't just about nice weather. The medieval warm period fundamentally transformed European society. Agriculture exploded, literally. The growing season extended by several weeks, allowing for crop yields that wouldn't be matched again until the 18th century. Population growth followed, with Europe's population nearly doubling between 1000 and 1300 AD. Think about it, longer growing seasons meant more food meant more people meant more workers meant more innovation meant more complex societies. It's like a civilization cheat code. Towns grew into cities, cities built cathedrals, and those cathedrals became the skyscrapers of their day, monuments to human ambition made possible by reliable harvests. The warm period also enabled what historians call the commercial revolution. Trade routes opened up across northern Europe that had been impassable for centuries. The Baltic Sea, which freezes solid in cold periods, remain navigable year-round. Ships could travel further, carry more cargo, and do it more safely. It's like going from dial-up internet to fiber optic cables. Suddenly, everything became possible. But here's the cruel irony that makes this story so compelling. This golden age of climate created a massive population boom that would make the coming disaster infinitely worse. It's like building a city on a floodplain during a drought. Everything seems perfect until the water comes back. The warm period allowed European populations to grow beyond what the land could normally sustain. Marginal lands were brought into cultivation, forests were cleared for farmland, and settlements pushed into areas that had been uninhabitable for centuries. It was sustainable as long as the good times rolled, but it created a civilization that was essentially living on borrowed time. Medieval chroniclers from this period describe a world that sounds almost utopian. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle mentions harvests so abundant that grain prices collapsed. French records speak of wine harvests that lasted well into October. Even the usually pessimistic church records, which normally focused on humanity's sins and sufferings, contain surprisingly cheerful accounts of prosperous harvests and well-fed populations. What's fascinating is how quickly this golden age became normalized. By 1200 AD, most Europeans had never known anything but good weather. Entire generations grew up expecting warm summers, mild winters, and reliable harvests. The very concept of widespread famine seemed like ancient history. It's like how we take modern medicine for granted, until you don't have it anymore. The architecture from this period tells the story beautifully. The great Gothic cathedrals, Notre Dame, Chartres, Canterbury, were all built during the medieval warm period. These weren't just religious buildings. They were massive construction projects that required enormous resources, skilled labor, and most importantly, surplus food to feed the workers. You can't build a cathedral when half your population is starving. The fact that dozens of these monuments were constructed simultaneously across Europe speaks to the incredible prosperity of the age. But nature, as we're about to discover, has a wicked sense of timing. Just as European civilization reached its medieval peak, just as populations had grown to unprecedented levels, just as people had forgotten what true hardship looked like, the climate began to shift. The first signs were subtle. Harvests that were merely good instead of abundant. Winters that felt a bit sharper. Springs that arrived a week or two later than expected. Most people didn't notice. Why would they? When you've lived your entire life in paradise, you don't recognize the early signs of paradise coming to an end. The warm period had lasted for 3 centuries. Longer than the United States has existed as a country. To medieval Europeans, warm weather wasn't a temporary blessing. It was simply how the world worked. They had no idea that they were living through one of the most favorable climate periods in human history. And they certainly couldn't imagine what was coming next. Because what came next would make the so-called Dark Ages look like a pleasant vacation by comparison. The stage was set for one of history's greatest climate disasters, and Europe, fat, happy, and completely unprepared, was about to get a brutal lesson in just how quickly paradise can turn into hell. You survived the shock of learning that medieval Europe was actually a climate paradise. Now comes the part that will completely blow your mind: England. Grey, rainy, tea-obsessed England was once one of Europe's premier wine-producing regions. And I'm not talking about some weak, pathetic attempt at viticulture. I'm talking about commercial-scale wine production that rivaled France and made the English rich. Step into the rolling hills of 12th century Yorkshire, and the landscape hits you like a fantasy novel come to life. Endless rows of grapevines stretch across hillsides that today couldn't grow a decent tomato. The air is thick with the sweet scent of ripening grapes, and the sound of harvest songs echoes across valleys where today you'd hear nothing but sheep bleating and tourists complaining about the weather. This isn't some romantic exaggeration. This is documented historical fact. The Domesday Book of 1086, that medieval equivalent of a tax audit, records 42 functioning vineyards across England. 42! That's more than some modern wine regions have today. And these weren't hobby gardens run by eccentric monks. These were serious commercial operations producing wine that was actually exported to continental Europe. Let me paint you a picture of just how absurd this was. Imagine modern-day Scotland suddenly becoming famous for its tropical fruit exports, or Alaska becoming America's new citrus capital. That's the level of climate difference we're talking about. The northernmost English vineyards were located at latitudes where today you'd struggle to grow anything more ambitious than potatoes. The monastery of Ely, deep in the English fenlands, operated one of the most successful vineyards in medieval Europe. These monks weren't just making communion wine, they were running what was essentially a medieval wine empire. Their records, preserved in the monastery archives, detail harvests that will make modern vintners weep with envy. We're talking about yields that consistently exceeded modern commercial standards, from grapes grown in areas that today are barely suitable for hardy vegetables. But here's where it gets really interesting. English wine wasn't just good. It was export quality. French merchants, the undisputed wine snobs of medieval Europe, were actually buying English wine and selling it back home. Think about that for a moment. The French were importing wine from England. It's like Italians importing pasta from McDonald's. Except it actually happened, and everyone was happy about it. The variety of grapes that thrived in medieval England reads like a Mediterranean wine list. Archaeological evidence shows that English vineyards were successfully growing grape varieties that today can only survive in southern France and northern Italy. Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and various Germanic varieties flourished in the warm English climate. Some monasteries even experimented with grape varieties that are now extinct, lost to the climate catastrophe that was coming. Winchester, the ancient capital of England, was essentially the medieval equivalent of Napa Valley. The city was surrounded by vineyards that produced wine so renowned that it was served at royal banquets across Europe. The Bishop of Winchester's wine was considered a diplomatic gift worthy of kings. Henry Sue, who ruled an empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, specifically requested English wine for his court celebrations. Now, let's talk about the economics of this viticultural miracle. Wine production in medieval England employed thousands of people and generated enormous wealth. The wine trade created a class of merchant, vintners who became some of the wealthiest non-nobles in medieval society. Entire villages existed solely to support vineyard operations. The town of Ledbury in Herefordshire was essentially a medieval wine boom town, complete with specialized coopers, merchants, and even primitive wine critics. The technology these medieval English winemakers developed was surprisingly sophisticated. They created drainage systems that wouldn't be out of place in modern vineyards, developed pruning techniques that maximized grape quality, and invented storage methods that allowed English wine to age gracefully. Some of their innovations were so effective that they were copied by French and German vintners. But here's the detail that really drives home how dramatically different the climate was. English winemakers were successfully producing sweet dessert wines. Not just any sweet wines, but wines that required extended growing seasons and consistent late-season warmth. They were making the medieval equivalent of sortines and ice wines in a climate that today struggles to ripen basic table grapes. The social impact of England's wine boom was enormous. Wine consumption became democratized in a way that wouldn't happen again for centuries. While today we think of wine as either cheap plonk or expensive luxury, medieval England had a thriving middle market wine industry. Ordinary merchants, skilled craftsmen, and even well-off peasants could afford locally produced wine. It was like having a craft brewery on every corner, except it was wine, and it was everywhere. Religious institutions were the biggest players in the wine game. Monasteries didn't just produce wine for religious ceremonies. They were running full-scale commercial operations. The Abbey of Glastonbury alone owned over 300 acres of vineyards. These weren't just grape gardens. They were sophisticated agricultural enterprises with advanced irrigation, specialized buildings, and skilled workforce management that would impress modern agribusiness executives. The quality control in medieval English wine production was surprisingly rigorous. Guild regulations specified everything from grape varieties to fermentation techniques. Wine had to meet specific standards before it could be sold commercially. There were official wine tasters, medieval sommeliers, who certified wine quality. The system was so sophisticated that it included appellations, early versions of the regional wine classifications we use today. Archaeological evidence from medieval English vineyards reveals tools and techniques that wouldn't be out of place in modern wineries. Grape presses, fermentation vats, and storage facilities show a level of technological sophistication that rivals contemporary wine production. Some of the wine storage caves built during this period are still in use today, having maintained perfect temperature and humidity conditions for nearly 1,000 years. The collapse of English wine production, when it came, was swift and total. Within a few decades, vineyards that had operated successfully for centuries were abandoned. The climate shift was so dramatic that grape varieties that had thrived for generations simply couldn't survive. It would be like California's entire wine industry vanishing overnight due to climate change. Except that's exactly what happened to England in the 14th century. Today, England is attempting to rebuild its wine industry, and modern climate change is actually helping. English sparkling wines are gaining international recognition, and vineyards are slowly creeping back into regions where they flourished 800 years ago. It's like history coming full circle, except this time we know what we lost. But in the 12th century, nobody could imagine that this wine paradise would ever end. The harvest seemed endless, the profits kept growing, and the future looked as bright as a perfect vintage. English winemakers were planning expansions, investing in new vineyards, and dreaming of generations of prosperity. They had no idea that they were living in the final decades of England's wine empire, and that within a century. Their vineyards would be buried under snow, and their wine cellars would freeze solid. The party was about to end, and nobody heard the music stopping. You survived learning that medieval England was basically the Napa Valley of Europe. Now comes the part where paradise starts to crack and the first whispers of disaster begin to echo across the continent. The year is 1315, and you're about to witness the moment when 3 centuries of good times come to a screeching halt. It starts so innocuously that you almost miss it. Picture yourself as a farmer in northern France checking your fields on a spring morning in 1315. The sun is out, birds are singing, and everything looks normal. Except, something feels off. The air has a different quality to it, cooler, damper, with an edge that makes you pull your cloak a little tighter. Your grandfather might have recognized this feeling But he died decades ago, and you've never experienced anything like it. The first warning sign isn't dramatic. It's not an earthquake or a plague or a Viking raid. It's just rain, lots and lots of rain. Starting in the spring of 1315, Western Europe gets hit with the kind of persistent, relentless precipitation that makes modern weather forecasters throw up their hands and quit. We're talking about rain that starts in March and doesn't stop until November. Rain that falls so consistently that chroniclers of the time literally ran out of words to describe it. But here's the thing that makes this story so terrifying. After 300 years of perfect weather, nobody knows how to handle a bad harvest anymore. The institutional memory is gone. The survival techniques that kept previous generations alive during lean years have been forgotten. It's like a society that's never known war suddenly finding itself under attack. The panic is total because the knowledge has been lost. The Annals Sancti Albani, one of the most detailed chronicles of the period, describes the 1315 weather with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for natural disasters. The rains descended without ceasing. The chronicler writes, as if the very heavens had opened their floodgates upon the earth. And this is from someone who was used to documenting famines, wars, and plagues as routine events. By summer 1315, it becomes clear that this isn't just a bad year. It's a catastrophe. Crops that should be golden and ready for harvest are rotting in the fields. Wheat yields drop by 80% across northern Europe. Oat harvests, which had been reliable for generations, completely fail. The price of grain begins what historians call the Great Price Spiral. Costs that double, then triple, then quadruple as panic buying sets in. Here's where the black humor of history kicks in. Europe's response to the first crisis in living memory is to make it infinitely worse. Governments, having never dealt with widespread famine, implement policies that would make a modern economist weep. Price controls are imposed, which immediately creates black markets. Grain exports are banned, which triggers hoarding. It's like watching a civilization collectively step on every economic landmine at once. The psychological impact is devastating. Imagine living your entire life with the assumption that food will always be available, that harvests will always be good, that the future will always be better than the past. Then suddenly, overnight, the fundamental assumptions of your existence crumble. It's like waking up to find out that gravity has stopped working. Everything you thought you knew about the world is suddenly wrong. The English, who had been so proud of their wine-producing climate, watch helplessly as their vineyards begin to fail. Not all at once, that would have been too merciful. Instead, it's a slow death by 1,000 cuts. Wine harvests become irregular, then poor, then non-existent. Vineyards that had operated successfully for centuries are abandoned within a decade. The wine trade, which had employed thousands and generated enormous wealth, simply evaporates. But the real horror isn't economic, it's social. After 300 years of abundance, European society had developed what historians call prosperity assumptions. Cities had grown beyond their ability to feed themselves. Populations had expanded into marginal lands that were only viable during good times. Trade networks had become so complex and interdependent that a single harvest failure could trigger continent-wide collapse. The summer of 1315 becomes a masterclass in how quickly civilization can unravel. Markets that had operated smoothly for generations suddenly can't function. Trade routes that had been reliable for centuries become impassable as desperation drives people to banditry. The carefully constructed social order of medieval Europe begins to crack under the pressure of empty stomachs. Religious institutions, which had grown fat and wealthy during the warm period, suddenly find themselves overwhelmed by desperate crowds begging for food. Monasteries that had been cheerfully producing wine and cheese for commercial sale are forced to open their doors to starving refugees. The same institutions that had celebrated God's abundance during the good years now struggle to explain why the Almighty has apparently abandoned his people. The technological systems that had supported medieval prosperity prove useless in the face of climate change. Those sophisticated agricultural techniques that had maximized yields during warm years become counterproductive when the weather turns cold and wet. The drainage systems that had opened up new farmland during dry periods now create waterlogged fields that can't support crops. Winter 1315-1316 arrives early and stays late, as if nature is personally insulted by Europe's centuries of good fortune. Chroniclers describe snow falling in September and staying on the ground until May. Rivers had been reliable transport routes freeze solid. The carefully maintained road networks that had enabled medieval commerce become impassable death traps. The mortality begins quietly. First, it's the elderly and the very young, the populations most vulnerable to nutritional stress. Then it spreads to the general population as malnutrition weakens immune systems and makes people susceptible to diseases that had been manageable during prosperous times. The death toll from the 1315-1316 winter is estimated at 10–15% of the population across Northern Europe. But here's the truly terrifying part. This is just the beginning. The Great Famine of 1315-1322 isn't a single bad year. It's 7 years of consecutive harvest failures, each one worse than the last. And even that isn't the real disaster. The real disaster is that this famine is just the opening act of a climate catastrophe that will last for 3 centuries. What makes 1315 so significant isn't just the immediate suffering, it's the psychological break it represents. After 300 years of prosperity, Europeans suddenly remember what their ancestors had always known, that civilization is fragile, that prosperity is temporary, and that nature can be absolutely merciless to those who forget their place in the world. The warm period had made Europeans soft, complacent, and completely unprepared for hardship. Now, as the first winter winds begin to bite with unfamiliar sharpness, they're about to get a crash course in survival that will reshape their entire civilization. The Golden Age is over, and the Age of Ice is about to begin. And this is still just the warm-up act. You survived the first warning signs of climate disaster. Now comes the part that will haunt your nightmares: what happens when an entire civilization runs out of food. The Great Famine of 1322 transforms medieval Europe into a real-life survival horror game where the rules of civilization don't just bend, they shatter completely. By 1316, it's clear that this isn't just a bad harvest year. This is something else entirely. You're standing in what used to be a thriving market square, but now it looks like a scene from a post-apocalyptic movie. Skeletal figures wander aimlessly, their eyes hollow and desperate. The stench of death hangs in the air, mixed with the acrid smell of desperation. This is Europe's first taste of what true famine looks like, and it's more horrifying than anything Hollywood could imagine. The numbers are staggering. In Normandy, chroniclers report that grain prices increased by 800% in a single year. 800%. That's like your grocery bill going from 100 to 800 overnight. In modern terms, it would be like a loaf of bread suddenly costing 40. Except there's no bread to buy at any price. The psychological transformation happens faster than you'd expect. People who had been respectable citizens just months before now fight over scraps like animals. The chronicler John of Troclo describes scenes that sound like something from a zombie apocalypse. Men devoured each other, and the dead were cut up and cooked. He's not speaking metaphorically. He's documenting actual cannibalism spreading across Christian Europe. Here's where the black humor of history becomes truly black: the first recorded instances of cannibalism during the Great Famine happen in monasteries. Yes, monasteries, those supposedly holy sanctuaries of Christian virtue. The Abbey of Stein. Dinas reports that starving refugees broke into the monastery and consumed the bodies of recently deceased monks. The irony is so dark it's almost poetic. People literally eating the body of Christ's servants while Christ's representatives debate theological responses to mass starvation. The social hierarchy that had seemed so permanent during the good times collapses with stunning speed. Nobles who had lived in luxury suddenly find themselves competing with peasants for tree bark and grass. The Count of Flanders, one of the richest men in Europe, is forced to sell his entire library, his books, his most prized possessions, just to buy enough grain to feed his household for a single month. But it's the children who suffer most, and their suffering reveals the true horror of medieval famine. Parents, driven mad by hunger, abandon their offspring in town squares, hoping someone else might feed them. Chroniclers describe finding children who have resorted to eating their own excrement. Not because they're insane, but because their bodies are so desperate for nutrients that they'll try to digest anything. The cannibalism starts with the dead, which is bad enough. But by 1318, it escalates to murder for food. The royal court records of France document cases of people killing their neighbors specifically to eat them. We're not talking about isolated incidents of madness. This is systematic, deliberate cannibalism driven by starvation. Some villages develop what can only be described as feeding hierarchies, where the strongest prey on the weakest in organized ways. The economic collapse is so complete that it breaks systems that had worked for centuries. The entire monetary system of medieval Europe becomes meaningless when there's nothing to buy. Gold and silver, which had been the foundation of medieval wealth, become worthless tokens. A chronicler in Flanders records a merchant offering a bag of gold coins for a single loaf of bread and being refused. Not because the bread seller wanted more money, but because money had become completely meaningless. Urban areas become death traps. Cities that had thrived during the warm period suddenly find themselves cut off from food supplies. The sophisticated trade networks that had supported urban growth collapse overnight. Bruges, which had been one of Europe's richest cities, loses over 30% of its population within 2 years. The survivors describe streets lined with corpses that nobody has the strength to bury. The religious response to mass starvation reveals the intellectual bankruptcy of medieval Christianity when faced with real crisis. Church authorities, who had preached about God's providence during the prosperous centuries, now offer explanations that would be laughable if they weren't so tragic. Some bishops actually blame the famine on excessive bathing, claiming that cleanliness has angered God. Others declare that the starvation is punishment for the sin of gluttony during the warm period. Rural areas fare slightly better, but only because they have more creative options for finding food. Peasants begin eating things that would make a modern survivalist gag: tree bark, grass, leather, and eventually each other. The chronicler William of Newburgh describes entire villages where the population has been reduced to eating boiled leather and the bodies of their neighbors. They consumed the flesh of horses, dogs, cats, and even human beings. He writes with the clinical detachment of someone documenting the end of the world. The psychological trauma of surviving the Great Famine creates a generation of Europeans who are fundamentally different from their ancestors. Children who survive this period grow up with a paranoid hoarding mentality that will define European culture for centuries. They develop an obsession with food security that makes modern preppers look casual. The very concept of wasting food becomes blasphemous to famine survivors. The technology that had supported medieval prosperity proves useless when the climate turns hostile. Those sophisticated agricultural techniques that had maximized yields during warm years become counterproductive in cold, wet conditions. The drainage systems that had opened up new farmland during dry periods now create waterlogged fields that can't support crops. It's like having a perfectly tuned sports car when what you need is a tank. Government responses to the famine are spectacularly incompetent. King Edward II of England, faced with mass starvation, issues royal proclamations ordering people to stop hoarding grain. It's like trying to stop a hurricane with a strongly worded letter. The French crown attempts to solve the crisis by devaluing currency, which only makes inflation worse. It's economic policy by panic, and it fails catastrophically. The mortality statistics are so horrific that they challenge medieval record-keeping systems. Some regions lose 40–50% of their population over 7 years. Entire villages simply disappear, not destroyed by war or plague, but abandoned as the survivors migrate desperately in search of food. The English rolls of the dead from this period are so extensive that they require their own scribes just to maintain the records. By 1322, when the famine finally ends, Europe has been fundamentally transformed. The population has been reduced by an estimated 15–20% overall, with some regions losing nearly half their inhabitants. The survivors are physically and psychologically scarred. The economic systems that had supported medieval prosperity have collapsed. The social hierarchies that had seemed permanent have been revealed as fragile constructs that dissolve under pressure. But here's the really terrifying part. The Great Famine isn't the disaster. It's just the opening act. The climate catastrophe that caused the famine is just beginning, and it will last for 3 more centuries. The survivors of 1350–1322 think they've endured the worst that nature can throw at them. They have no idea that they've just experienced the gentle preview of what's coming next. The age of abundance is over. The age of survival has begun. And the next chapter of this climate nightmare is about to make the Great Famine look like a minor inconvenience. You survived the horrors of the Great Famine, thinking that surely Europe had endured the worst nature could throw at it. But the climate catastrophe was just getting warmed up, or should I say, cooled down. What came next was a perfect storm of environmental and biological disaster that would make the cannibalism of the 1310s look like a mild inconvenience. By 1347, Europe had barely recovered from the trauma of the Great Famine when the next wave of the climate disaster arrived. Except this time, it didn't come alone. It brought a friend. A tiny, microscopic friend that would kill 1/3 of the European population in just 5 years. The Black Death wasn't just a random plague outbreak. It was a biological weapon delivered by climate change, and Europe was the perfect target. Picture yourself in the port city of Kaffa in 1347, watching a ship slowly drift into harbor. The vessel moves strangely, listing to one side, its sails hanging limp. As it gets closer, you notice something that makes your blood run cold. There's no crew on deck. The ship is steering itself, guided by dead men's hands, still gripping the wheel. Welcome to patient zero of the most devastating pandemic in human history. But here's the thing that makes this story so terrifying. The Black Death didn't just happen to arrive during the Little Ice Age. The climate disaster created the perfect conditions for a plague outbreak that would have been manageable under normal circumstances. It's like the climate and the plague formed a tag team specifically designed to destroy European civilization. The connection between climate change and plague is diabolically simple. The cooling temperatures that had already devastated European agriculture did something even worse. They disrupted the ecological balance that had kept plague, carrying rats and fleas under control. During the warm period, European ecosystems had developed natural predators that kept rodent populations in check. But when the climate shifted, those predator populations crashed, creating a rat paradise just in time for the plague to arrive. The famine had already done the plague's work for it. Malnutrition from 7 years of failed harvests had weakened the immune systems of virtually every European alive. People who might have survived plague exposure under normal circumstances were now sitting ducks. It's like the famine had loaded Europe with victims, and the plague just had to show up to collect. The social disruption from the climate disaster made everything worse. The Great Famine had destroyed the infrastructure that might have contained a plague outbreak. Trade routes that had been disrupted by starvation became perfect vectors for disease transmission. Refugee populations, displaced by agricultural collapse, created overcrowded, unsanitary conditions that were basically plague incubators. The psychological trauma from the famine created a population that was already mentally broken when the plague arrived. People who had survived cannibalism, who had watched their children starve, who had eaten their neighbors. These weren't mentally healthy individuals capable of making rational decisions about public health. They were traumatized survivors who often reacted to the plague with a kind of religious hysteria that made outbreaks worse. The economic collapse from the climate disaster meant that European governments were completely unprepared to handle a pandemic. The sophisticated administrative systems that had managed medieval prosperity had already been destroyed by famine. When the plague arrived, there were no functioning public health systems, no effective government responses, and no economic resources to mount a coordinated defense. Here's where the dark humor of history gets really dark. The plague actually thrived in the cold, wet conditions that the Little Ice Age had created. The bacterium Yersinia pestis, which causes plague, survives longer in cool, humid environments. The climate change had literally created better living conditions for the plague bacteria, while making survival harder for humans. It's like the climate was actively rooting for the plague. The rats that carried the plague, bearing fleas, were also climate refugees. As temperatures dropped across Central Asia, rat populations migrated westward, bringing their plague-infected fleas with them. The same climate patterns that had destroyed European agriculture created migration routes for plague-carrying rodents. The cooling temperatures that had ended the medieval warm period essentially created a plague superhighway from Asia to Europe. The speed of the plague spread was accelerated by the climate disaster. Normal trade patterns had been disrupted by agricultural collapse, creating desperate attempts to find food and resources. Merchants, refugees, and migrants carried the plague along routes that would have been less traveled under normal circumstances. The chaos created by climate change turned every human movement into a potential plague vector. The medical knowledge that might have helped Europeans understand and combat the plague had been lost during the social collapse that followed the famine. The sophisticated medical schools that had flourished during the warm period were either closed or severely damaged. The physicians who survived the famine were often malnourished themselves and lacked the resources to study or treat the new disease effectively. The plague's arrival in 1347 was like a horror movie sequel that's infinitely worse than the original. Just as European society was beginning to recover from the trauma of mass starvation, along comes a disease that kills faster and more efficiently than anything the continent had ever experienced. The plague didn't just kill people, it killed them in ways that were psychologically devastating to the survivors. The symptoms of plague are designed to maximize horror. The bubonic form creates swellings the size of eggs or apples that turn black and burst, filling the air with a stench that survivors describe as the smell of death itself. The pneumonic form causes victims to cough up blood and die within hours. The septicemic form kills so quickly that people literally drop dead in the streets. It's like the plague was specifically engineered to create maximum psychological trauma. The religious response to the plague reveals how completely the climate disaster had broken medieval European society. The same church that had struggled to explain the Great Famine now faced a disease that seemed to mock every theological explanation. Some preachers declared that the plague was God's final judgment on humanity. Others claimed it was a test of faith. The most honest admitted they had no idea what was happening and recommended prayer, penance, and panic. The social responses to the plague were made worse by the climate-induced breakdown of normal social order. The flagellant movements, where people whipped themselves bloody in public processions, were partly a response to the plague, but also a continuation of the religious hysteria that had emerged during the famine. The persecution of Jews, who were blamed for poisoning wells, was enabled by the collapse of legal and social protections that had occurred during the climate crisis. The economic impact of the plague was devastating partly because European society had already been weakened by climate-induced agricultural collapse. The sophisticated trade networks that had supported medieval prosperity were still recovering from famine. Related disruption when the plague destroyed them completely. It's like having your house damaged by a tornado and then hit by an earthquake before you can rebuild. The mortality rates from the plague were so high that they challenged the basic assumptions of medieval society. Some regions lost 60–80% of their population. Entire villages were abandoned. Cathedrals stood empty because there weren't enough people left to maintain them. The plague didn't just kill people, it killed the idea that European civilization was permanent and stable. But here's the most terrifying part. The plague outbreak of 1347–1351 was just the beginning. The climate conditions that had made the first outbreak so devastating persisted for centuries. The plague returned in waves, 1361, 1369, 1374, 1400, and on. Each outbreak was enabled by the same climate factors that had made the first one so catastrophic. The Black Death wasn't just a disease. It was climate change's biological weapon, perfectly designed to exploit the weaknesses that cooling temperatures had created in European society. And as the Little Ice Age deepened, as winters got longer and summers got shorter, the plague would keep coming back, each time finding new vulnerabilities in a civilization that was slowly freezing to death. The age of abundance was a fading memory. The age of survival was proving inadequate. Welcome to the age of dying, where even the dead weren't safe from the cold. You survived the double catastrophe of famine and plague ravaging mainland Europe. Now let me tell you about something even more heartbreaking. Watching an entire civilization slowly freeze to death in complete isolation, one generation at a time. Welcome to the Greenland Viking colonies, where the Little Ice Age didn't just kill people, it erased them so thoroughly that for centuries, nobody even remembered they had existed. Picture this. You're standing on the shores of Greenland in 1400 AD, looking out at what was once the most successful Arctic colony in human history. But there's nothing left. No people, No livestock, no signs of life. Just empty stone houses slowly being reclaimed by ice, and the sound of wind whistling through abandoned churches. This is what climate change looks like when it has centuries to work, not dramatic destruction, but slow, merciless erasure. The Greenland Vikings weren't just any settlers. They were the ultimate success story of medieval colonization. When Eric the Red established the first permanent settlements around 985 AD, during the height of the medieval warm period, he wasn't just founding a colony. He was creating what would become one of the most isolated yet thriving communities in the medieval world. For over 400 years, these Norse settlers built a civilization that was arguably more impressive than anything happening in mainland Europe. During the warm period, Greenland lived up to its name. The Vikings raised cattle, sheep, and goats in pastures that are now permanently frozen. They built churches that could seat hundreds of people, established trade networks that stretched from Greenland to Constantinople, and created a society sophisticated enough to have its own bishop. The Western settlement alone supported over 4,000 people, while the Eastern settlement had nearly 6,000. That's more people than many European cities of the time. But here's what makes their story so tragic. They were living on borrowed time, and they knew it. As the climate began to shift in the 14th century, the Greenland Vikings found themselves in an impossible situation. They were too far from Europe to evacuate easily, too invested in their farms and communities to abandon them quickly, and too proud to admit that their ancestors' great achievement was becoming uninhabitable. The cooling started slowly, almost imperceptibly. Summers became shorter, winters longer. The growing season that had supported their livestock gradually shrank. The sea ice that had been a minor winter inconvenience began lasting longer each year, sometimes blocking supply ships from Europe for 2 or 3 years at a time. It's like watching the ocean slowly rise around your island, except instead of water, it was cold, relentless, crushing cold. The archaeological evidence of their slow death is heartbreaking. In the early settlements, Viking graves contain the remains of tall, well-nourished people buried with impressive grave goods. But as the climate deteriorated, the graves tell a different story. The skeletons get smaller, showing signs of malnutrition. The grave goods disappear. By the final centuries, they're burying people in permafrost so hard they can barely dig graves deep enough to keep the bodies from freezing solid. The livestock tell an even more tragic story. During the warm period, Greenland Vikings raised cattle that were as large and healthy as any in Europe. But as temperatures dropped, the cattle began to shrink, not just getting thinner, actually becoming smaller generation by generation as they adapted to increasingly harsh conditions. By the 1400s, archaeological evidence shows they were raising cattle that were barely larger than modern sheep. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of their slow death. During the warm period, Greenland maintained regular contact with Europe through trade ships that arrived every summer. The Vikings exported walrus ivory, polar bear furs, and other Arctic specialties in exchange for iron, timber, and luxury goods. But as the sea ice expanded, these trade routes became increasingly dangerous and eventually impossible. The last recorded ship from Europe to reach Greenland arrived in 1410. Think about that for a moment, an entire civilization, thousands of people, cut off from the rest of the world for decades. No news, no supplies, no hope of rescue. It's like being marooned on a desert island, except the island is slowly turning into a freezer and there's no chance of a rescue ship ever arriving. The psychological impact of this isolation was devastating. The Greenland Vikings had been proud members of the greater Norse world, part of a culture that stretched from Iceland to Russia. Suddenly, they were alone, watching their world literally freeze around them. The last generation of Greenland Vikings grew up knowing that they were the end of the line, that their culture would die with them. Religious records from the period show the community's growing desperation. The last bishop of Greenland was appointed in 1378, but by 1400, there's no evidence he was still alive. The churches that had been the center of Viking social life began to be abandoned, not because of lost faith, but because there weren't enough people left to maintain them. Some churches show evidence of being converted into storage buildings as the communities struggled to survive. The Western settlement was the first to go. By 1350, it was completely abandoned. The Eastern settlement held on longer, but even it was showing signs of desperate decline. The last written record from Greenland is a marriage certificate from 1408, documenting a wedding that probably took place in a nearly empty church in a community that was already doomed. The way they died is particularly heartbreaking. Unlike the dramatic famines and plagues that devastated mainland Europe, the Greenland Vikings just faded away. Some probably died of starvation as their livestock herds dwindled. Others may have succumbed to diseases brought by the last trading ships. Some might have attempted desperate journeys to find help, sailing into the Arctic Ocean and never returning. The final generation faced an impossible choice: die slowly in Greenland or risk almost certain death trying to escape. The sea ice that had cut them off from Europe also made escape nearly impossible. Any ship attempting to reach Iceland or Norway would have to navigate through pack ice that could crush a vessel in minutes. It's like being trapped in a burning building where all the exits are blocked. But here's the detail that makes their story even more tragic: they never lost hope. Archaeological evidence shows that right up until the end, they were still maintaining their European customs, still speaking Norse, still practicing Christianity. They could have adapted to Inuit survival techniques, learned to hunt seals and build igloos, but they remained culturally Viking until the very end. The Inuit, who had been moving into Greenland as the climate cooled, occasionally encountered the last Vikings. Inuit oral traditions describe strange pale people who lived in stone houses and refused to learn proper hunting techniques. The cultural barrier between the two groups was so strong that even facing extinction, the Vikings wouldn't abandon their way of life. The irony is cruel. The same climate change that was destroying Viking civilization was actually helping the Inuit, who were better adapted to cold conditions. As the Vikings died out, Inuit populations expanded into the same areas, thriving in the conditions that had killed their predecessors. It's like watching one species evolve to replace another, except it happened in human time scales. When European explorers finally returned to Greenland in the 16th century, they found no trace of the Viking settlements. The stone buildings were still there, but they were empty shells. Some contained mummified remains of the last inhabitants, preserved by the cold that had killed them. It was like discovering an entire civilization had simply vanished into the ice. The Greenland Vikings represent the ultimate tragedy of the Little Ice Age, a thriving civilization that was slowly, methodically erased by climate change. They weren't conquered by enemies or destroyed by disasters. They were simply forgotten by a world that had moved on while they froze to death in isolation. Their story is a preview of what was happening across the Arctic during the Little Ice Age. Indigenous communities that had thrived for millennia were forced to abandon traditional territories. Trade routes that had connected civilizations for centuries became impassable. The very geography of the northern world was being rewritten by ice. But the Greenland Vikings were just the beginning. As the Little Ice Age deepened, as winters got longer and summers disappeared entirely, the cold would claim victims much closer to home. The ice was coming for everyone, and Europe was about to learn that even the heart of civilization wasn't safe from the advancing cold. You survived witnessing an entire civilization freeze to death in Greenland. Now let me show you something that's simultaneously more cheerful and more disturbing. What happens when people decide that, if they can't beat the ice, they'll throw a party on it. Welcome to the Thames Frost Fairs, where London turned a climate disaster into the world's most bizarre shopping experience. Picture this, it's January 1684, and you're standing on what should be the Thames River, except you're not getting wet. You're standing on solid ice thick enough to support entire buildings. Around you, hundreds of people are conducting business as if this is completely normal. There are taverns built on the ice, complete with roaring fires and drunk patrons. There are printing presses churning out commemorative certificates. There are oxen being roasted over open flames, their fat sizzling and popping in the frigid air. This isn't just a frozen river, it's a frozen economy. And somehow, impossibly, it's working. The Thames Frost Fairs weren't just quaint medieval festivals. They were full-scale commercial operations that operated on solid ice for weeks at a time. We're talking about a parallel economy that only existed when the climate was cold enough to freeze one of Europe's major rivers solid. It's like if Amazon decided to set up a temporary headquarters in Antarctica, except this actually happened, and people made it work. The first recorded frost fair was in 1608, but by the 1680s, they had become so elaborate that they were essentially temporary cities built on ice. The winter of 1683-1684 was so severe that the Thames froze to a depth of nearly 3 feet. That's thick enough to support not just people walking, but horses, carriages, and even small buildings. Londoners looked at this climate catastrophe and thought, you know what? Let's make some money off this. The entrepreneurial spirit of the Frost Fairs was both inspiring and slightly insane. Within days of the river freezing solid, merchants would establish entire shopping districts on the ice. There were bookshops, toy vendors, food stalls, and even barber shops operating in temporary wooden structures built directly on the frozen Thames. It's like a pop-up mall that only appears during climate disasters. The most famous attraction was the ox roasting. Not just any ox, entire oxen, roasted on spits over massive fires built directly on the ice. The contrast was surreal. Blazing fires casting dancing shadows on the frozen river, while crowds of people in heavy winter clothes gathered around to buy hot meat. The smell of roasting beef mixed with the sharp, clean scent of ice and snow created an olfactory experience that was uniquely apocalyptic. But here's what makes the Frost Fairs so fascinating. They were simultaneously a celebration and a survival strategy. London's normal economy was completely disrupted when the Thames froze. Ships couldn't reach the city, trade ground to a halt, and thousands of people who depended on river commerce were suddenly unemployed. The Frost Fairs weren't just entertainment. They were an emergency economic response to climate disaster. The printing presses on the ice were particularly clever. Entrepreneurs would set up portable printing equipment and produce commemorative certificates for visitors. These weren't just souvenirs. They were proof that you had survived one of the most extreme weather events in English history. People would pay good money for a certificate stating that they had walked on the frozen Thames, complete with the date and their name. It's like getting a selfie with a natural disaster, except the selfie was a hand-printed document. The social dynamics of the frost fairs were remarkably egalitarian. When you're standing on a frozen river that could potentially crack and kill everyone, social hierarchies become less important. Nobles and peasants shopped side by side, drank in the same taverns, and shared the same risks. It's like a medieval version of disaster socialism, where extreme circumstances create temporary equality. The children's games on the ice were both heartwarming and terrifying. Kids would play football on the frozen Thames, skate with makeshift bone skates, and build snowmen using ice chunks from the river. But they were also playing these games on a frozen river in the middle of January, during what was probably the coldest weather in living memory. It's like watching kids play in a snowstorm while their parents conduct business as if this is perfectly normal. The religious responses to the frost fairs reveal the psychological complexity of how people dealt with climate disaster. Some preachers declared the frozen Thames to be a sign of God's judgment and urged people to repent. Others saw it as a miracle and encouraged celebration. The most pragmatic simply set up temporary chapels on the ice and offered special services for people who wanted to pray while shopping. It's theological adaptation at its most flexible. The technology required to make the frost fairs work was surprisingly sophisticated. Merchants had to figure out how to build temporary structures on ice that would be stable enough for business, but portable enough to be removed quickly if the ice started to crack. They developed heating systems that could warm buildings without melting the ice beneath them. They created transportation networks that could move goods across a frozen river. It's like extreme architectural engineering under impossible conditions. The food at the frost fairs was an adventure in itself. Beyond the famous roasted ox, there were vendors selling hot drinks, roasted chestnuts, and various forms of preserved meat. But they also sold ice treats, not because they were trying to be ironic, but because ice preservation was suddenly unlimited and free. It's like having a free freezer the size of a major river. The entertainment was equally creative. There were puppet shows performed in heated tents, music performances by musicians whose instruments were probably freezing as they played, and even bear baiting events held on the ice. The most popular entertainment was simply watching people slip and fall, which sounds cruel until you realize that in a world where everyone was constantly on the verge of hypothermia, physical comedy was probably a crucial psychological survival mechanism. The economic impact of the frost fairs was significant enough to be recorded in official city records. The Lord Mayor of London actually issued permits for businesses operating on the ice, creating a formal regulatory framework for commerce conducted during climate disasters. Tax collectors ventured onto the frozen Thames to collect duties from ice merchants. It's like bureaucracy adapting to the apocalypse. The most remarkable aspect of the frost fairs was how quickly they could be assembled and disassembled. When the Thames froze, merchants would have temporary shops operational within days. When the ice showed signs of weakening, the entire operation could be packed up and moved to safety within hours. It's like a commercial flash mob that only appears during extreme weather events. The danger was always present, of course. The Thames might be frozen solid, but ice is never completely stable. There are recorded instances of people falling through weak spots and drowning in the freezing water beneath. Some temporary buildings collapsed when the ice shifted. The combination of open fires, wooden structures, and unpredictable ice created constant risk of disaster. But perhaps the most telling detail about the frost fairs is what they reveal about human adaptability. Faced with a climate catastrophe that had frozen their primary commercial waterway, Londoners didn't just survive, they innovated. They turned a disaster into an opportunity, a crisis into a celebration, and a frozen river into a thriving marketplace. The Frost Fairs were a uniquely English response to the Little Ice Age, practical, entrepreneurial, and slightly mad. While other European cities were struggling with frozen rivers and disrupted commerce, London was throwing parties on the ice and making money from climate disaster. It's like the entire city decided that if they were going to freeze to death, they might as well have fun doing it. But even as Londoners celebrated on the frozen Thames, even as they turned climate catastrophe into commercial opportunity, the underlying reality was inescapable. The river was frozen because the world was getting colder. The Frost Fairs were a symptom of climate change, not a solution to it. And as the Little Ice Age deepened, as winters got longer and summers disappeared, even the most creative human adaptations would prove insufficient against the advancing cold. The ice was having the last laugh, even as people danced on its surface. You survived the bizarre spectacle of Londoners throwing parties on frozen rivers. Now comes the part that's actually inspiring, watching an entire continent get backed into a corner by climate change and respond by completely reinventing how humans grow food. The Little Ice Age didn't just kill people, it also created the most dramatic agricultural revolution in European history, born from pure desperation and human ingenuity. Picture yourself as a farmer in the Netherlands in 1550, staring at your flooded fields for the third year in a row. Your grandfather's farming methods, which had worked perfectly for generations, are now completely useless. The crops that fed your family for centuries are rotting in waterlogged soil. The weather patterns that your ancestors relied on have become chaotic and unpredictable. You have two choices: innovate or starve. Welcome to the world's first climate-driven agricultural revolution. This wasn't some gradual evolution of farming techniques. This was panic-driven innovation on a massive scale. European farmers, faced with climate conditions that made traditional agriculture impossible, had to completely reimagine how food production worked. It's like if modern farmers suddenly had to grow crops on Mars. Except instead of moving to another planet, the planet had moved out from under them. The Dutch became the unlikely heroes of this agricultural revolution, partly because they had the most to lose. The Netherlands during the Little Ice Age was basically an ongoing disaster zone. Rising sea levels combined with increased rainfall created a landscape that was more water than land. Traditional farming was impossible. You can't grow wheat in a swamp, and you can't raise cattle on land that's underwater half the year. So the Dutch did something that would have seemed insane to their ancestors. They decided to fight the ocean itself. The massive land reclamation projects of the 16th and 17th centuries weren't just engineering marvels. They were acts of agricultural desperation. The polders, those famously flat Dutch farmlands, were literally stolen from the sea by farmers who had run out of other options. It's like deciding to solve your housing crisis by building on the moon. The technology they developed was revolutionary. The windmills that we now think of as charming tourist attractions were actually sophisticated water management systems designed to make agriculture possible in impossible conditions. These weren't just grinding grain. They were pumping water, draining fields, and creating artificial microclimates that could support crops in a world where normal farming had become impossible. But the real revolution was in crop selection. The plants that had sustained European agriculture for millennia, wheat, barley, oats, were proving inadequate for the new climate reality. So European farmers began experimenting with crops that had never been widely cultivated before. This is where the story gets really interesting. The Little Ice Age forced Europeans to diversify their agriculture in ways that would eventually feed the world. The potato, which would become one of Europe's most important crops, was initially viewed with deep suspicion. It was a strange South American plant that grew underground and looked vaguely demonic. But potatoes had one crucial advantage. They could survive in cold, wet conditions that killed grain crops. Desperate farmers began growing them not because they wanted to, but because they had to. It's like being forced to eat insects during a famine and discovering they're actually nutritious. The agricultural techniques that emerged from climate desperation were genuinely innovative. Crop rotation, which had been practiced in limited forms, became systematic and scientific. Farmers developed new methods of soil management, drainage, and fertilization that were specifically designed to work in the harsh conditions of the Little Ice Age. It's like being forced to become a better driver because all the roads have become dangerous. The social impact of these agricultural innovations was enormous. The new farming methods required more labor, but they also supported larger populations. Villages that had been decimated by famine began to recover. The increased food security that came from climate, adapted agriculture created the foundation for population growth that would eventually fuel the Industrial Revolution. It's like building a stronger foundation by necessity, only to discover it can support a much larger structure. The development of greenhouse agriculture was another climate-driven innovation. The Dutch, faced with growing seasons that were too short and unpredictable for outdoor cultivation, began experimenting with enclosed growing spaces. These early greenhouses were crude by modern standards, but they represented a revolutionary idea that humans could create their own climates for agriculture. It's like deciding that if the weather won't cooperate, you'll make your own weather. The selective breeding of livestock during this period was driven by similar pressures. Animals that had thrived during the medieval warm period were too large and required too much feed to survive the harsh conditions of the Little Ice Age. Farmers began breeding smaller, hardier animals that could survive on less food and tolerate colder temperatures. It's like evolution in fast forward, driven by human selection rather than natural selection. The preservation techniques that developed during this period were crucial for survival. The long, harsh winters of the Little Ice Age meant that food had to be stored for much longer periods than during the warm centuries. Europeans developed sophisticated methods of smoking, salting, pickling, and drying that could keep food edible for months. It's like becoming a master of food preservation because your life depends on it. The agricultural innovations of the Little Ice Age weren't just about survival. They were about optimization. Farmers didn't just adapt to the new conditions, they found ways to make the new conditions work better than the old ones. The diversified agriculture that emerged from climate necessity was actually more resilient and productive than the monoculture systems that had dominated during the warm period. The knowledge transfer during this period was remarkable. Agricultural innovations that worked in one region were rapidly adopted across Europe. The communication networks that had been disrupted by climate disaster were rebuilt specifically to share survival techniques. It's like a continent, wide-open source project focused on not starving to death. The economic implications were transformative. The new agricultural methods required different tools, different seeds, different techniques. This created entirely new industries and trade networks. The agricultural revolution of the Little Ice Age wasn't just about growing food. It was about creating new forms of economic organization that could function in a hostile climate. The psychological impact on European farmers was profound. The generation that lived through the transition from warm period agriculture to Little Ice Age farming developed a completely different relationship with nature. They learned to see the environment as something to be actively managed rather than simply exploited. It's like going from being a tourist to being a survival expert in your own backyard. The innovations weren't just technical. They were also organizational. The agricultural cooperatives and sharing systems that emerged during this period were responses to the reality that individual farmers couldn't survive the climate crisis alone. Communities that had been independent for centuries learned to pool resources and share knowledge. It's like forced socialism driven by climate necessity. The irony is that the agricultural revolution forced by the Little Ice Age created the foundation for European expansion and colonization. The improved food security and population growth that resulted from climate adapted agriculture provided the human and economic resources that would eventually allow Europeans to dominate global trade and exploration. The climate disaster that nearly destroyed European civilization ended up making it stronger. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this agricultural revolution was how quickly it happened. Within a few generations, European farmers completely transformed their methods, their crops, and their relationship with the land. It's like watching an entire civilization learn to swim while it's drowning. The agricultural innovations of the Little Ice Age didn't just solve the immediate crisis. They created the foundation for modern European prosperity. The techniques developed during this period of climate emergency became the basis for agricultural practices that would eventually feed the world. It's like being forced to invent new solutions to an impossible problem, only to discover that your solutions work better than anything that came before. The Little Ice Age had forced Europeans to become better farmers, but it had also created something else, a generation of people who knew that human ingenuity could triumph over natural disasters. This confidence, born from agricultural necessity, would soon drive Europeans to seek new worlds to conquer. The climate that had nearly destroyed them was about to become their greatest advantage. You survived watching Europe reinvent agriculture through sheer desperation. Now comes the part that's morally complicated. How climate disaster transformed Europeans from struggling farmers into global conquerors. The Little Ice Age didn't just force Europeans to innovate at home. It drove them to seek new worlds to exploit, turning climate refugees into colonial masters. Picture yourself as a Spanish conquistador in 1520, standing on the shores of Mexico and feeling actual warmth on your face for the first time in years. Behind you lies a Europe where winters last 8 months and summers barely exist. Ahead of you lies a land where the sun actually shines, where crops grow year-round, and where the very concept of starvation seems like a distant nightmare. This isn't just exploration, it's climate-driven escape from a continent that's slowly freezing to death. The age of exploration wasn't just about adventure or curiosity. It was about survival. European powers didn't suddenly develop wanderlust in the 15th and 16th centuries. They developed desperate need. The same climate catastrophe that had killed millions of Europeans and destroyed traditional agriculture had also created an urgent imperative: find new resources, new lands, and new opportunities, or watch your civilization slowly die of cold and hunger. The timing isn't coincidental. The great voyages of discovery, Columbus in 1492, Vasco da Gama in 1498, Magellan in 1511, all happened during the deepest phases of the Little Ice Age. These weren't romantic adventures undertaken by bold explorers seeking glory. These were desperate escape attempts by representatives of societies that were running out of options. It's like being forced to move to a new city because your old one is being demolished, except the demolition crew is climate change. The economic pressures driving exploration were directly related to climate disaster. European agriculture, even after the innovations of the agricultural revolution, couldn't support the populations that had grown during the medieval warm period. The spice trade, which had sustained European economies for centuries, was disrupted by climate-related political instability. Traditional trade routes through the Mediterranean and overland to Asia were becoming unreliable. European powers needed new sources of wealth, and they needed them desperately. The psychological impact of the Little Ice Age on European explorers was profound. These were people who had grown up in a world where survival was uncertain, where climate could kill you without warning, where the very concept of prosperity seemed like a luxury. When they encountered lands with reliable climates and abundant resources, the contrast was overwhelming. It's like people who've lived through a nuclear winter suddenly discovering a tropical paradise. The Spanish conquistadors provide the most dramatic example of climate-driven expansion. Spain, which had been devastated by the Little Ice Age, suddenly found itself in control of vast territories with climates that were not just habitable, but actually pleasant. The gold and silver that flowed from the Americas didn't just make Spain rich. It provided the economic foundation that allowed the country to survive the ongoing climate crisis at home. The demographic patterns of European expansion reveal the climate connection clearly. The regions that Europeans colonized most aggressively were those with climates that were warmer and more stable than what they had left behind. The Caribbean, Central America, and parts of South America became European colonies not just because they were accessible, but because they offered the kind of climate stability that Europe had lost centuries before. The agricultural colonization of the Americas was driven by climate necessity. European crops that had struggled to survive in the harsh conditions of the Little Ice Age thrived in the warmer climates of the New World. Sugar, tobacco, and cotton became colonial cash crops, not just because they were profitable, but because they were impossible to grow in the increasingly cold and wet conditions of Europe. It's like moving your business to a location where the operating conditions are actually favorable. The contrast between European climate reality and New World opportunities was stark. While European farmers were struggling to grow potatoes in waterlogged fields, colonial plantations were producing crops that couldn't even survive in European climates. The wealth generated by these climate-advantaged colonies flowed back to Europe, where it was used to fund further expansion and to support populations that the European climate could no longer sustain. The Native American civilizations that Europeans encountered had developed in climates that were not just stable, but actually improving during the Little Ice Age. The Aztec and Inca empires were at their peak partly because their territories were benefiting from climate patterns that were destroying European societies. The irony is cruel. Climate change was weakening the civilizations that would become colonizers while strengthening the civilizations that would be colonized. The military advantages that allowed small European forces to conquer vast American empires were partly climate-related. Europeans had developed technologies and tactics that were specifically adapted to harsh, resource-scarce environments. When they encountered societies that had developed in abundant, stable climates, the contrast in military efficiency was overwhelming. It's like Arctic survival experts suddenly finding themselves in a tropical resort. They're overqualified for the conditions. The disease transmission that devastated Native American populations was also climate-related. Europeans carried diseases that had evolved in the harsh, overcrowded conditions of Little Ice Age Europe. Native American populations, living in more favorable climates with less population density, had not developed immunity to these diseases. The climate disaster that had made Europeans hardy had also made them biological weapons. The plantation system that emerged in the Americas was a direct response to European climate pressures. The crops that made plantation agriculture profitable, sugar, tobacco, cotton, were crops that couldn't be grown in Little Ice Age Europe. The enslaved labor that worked these plantations was partly justified by the economic argument that European workers couldn't survive in tropical climates. It's a horrific irony. Climate change driving both the need for expansion and the justification for exploitation. The economic systems that supported European expansion were funded by climate necessity. The banking houses of Venice, Genoa, and later Amsterdam that financed exploration and colonization were responding to the reality that European domestic economies were struggling under climate pressure. Investment in overseas ventures wasn't just profitable, it was necessary for survival. The alternative was watching European civilization slowly freeze to death. The technological innovations that made long-distance exploration possible were also climate-driven. The improved navigation techniques, ship designs, and preservation methods that enabled transoceanic voyages were developed partly in response to the harsh conditions of the Little Ice Age. Europeans became better explorers because they had to become better survivors. The religious justifications for colonization were complicated by climate reality. The Catholic Church's mission to convert indigenous peoples was partly driven by the theological crisis created by the Little Ice Age. If God was punishing Europe with harsh climates and crop failures, then perhaps divine favor could be recovered by expanding Christianity to new lands. It's like trying to improve your relationship with an angry deity by introducing him to new friends. The cultural exchange that resulted from European expansion was shaped by climate differences. European colonists in the Americas adopted indigenous agricultural techniques, not just because they were curious, but because they were more effective in the new climates. The crops that indigenous peoples had developed, maize, potatoes, tomatoes, eventually became crucial for European survival during the continuing climate crisis. The long-term consequences of climate-driven expansion were enormous. The wealth that flowed from the Americas to Europe allowed European powers to survive the Little Ice Age and eventually emerge as global dominators. The demographic patterns established during this period of climate-driven expansion created the foundation for European global hegemony that would last for centuries. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this story is how climate necessity was used to justify terrible things. The exploitation of indigenous peoples, the establishment of slavery, the destruction of entire civilizations. All of these were enabled by the argument that Europeans needed new resources to survive their climate crisis. It's like using natural disasters to justify crime, except the crime was conducted on a global scale. The Little Ice Age had turned Europeans into climate refugees, but it had also given them the technological and organizational advantages that would allow them to dominate the world. The same harsh conditions that had nearly destroyed European civilization had also forged it into something harder, more desperate, and more dangerous than anything that had come before. The climate crisis that had begun as Europe's greatest disaster was becoming the world's greatest catastrophe. The ice that had driven Europeans from their homeland was about to reshape the entire planet. And not everyone would benefit from the change. You survived the moral complexity of climate disaster driving global conquest. Now comes the final revelation: what Europe looked like when the ice finally retreated and the long winter ended. By 1850, as temperatures began to rise and the Little Ice Age finally released its grip, the continent that emerged was unrecognizable from the one that had entered the crisis 5 centuries earlier. Picture yourself standing in London in 1850, breathing air that actually feels warm for the first time in generations. The Thames is flowing freely, no longer the frozen highway of the frost fairs. But this isn't the same London that existed before the Little Ice Age. This is something entirely new, a city powered by steam, filled with factories belching smoke, connected to the world by railways and telegraph wires. The climate disaster that nearly destroyed European civilization had somehow transformed it into the most powerful force on Earth. The numbers tell an incredible story. In 1300, at the end of the medieval warm period, Europe's population was around 70 million. By 1850, despite centuries of famine, plague, and climate disaster, it had grown to over 200 million. The continent that had barely survived the Little Ice Age now supported 3 times as many people as it had during the supposed Golden Age. It's like watching a forest emerge from a wildfire stronger and more diverse than it had ever been before. The agricultural revolution that had been forced by climate necessity had created the foundation for industrialization. Those improved farming techniques, developed out of pure desperation during the harsh centuries, now produced food surpluses that could support massive urban populations. The crop diversification that had been a survival strategy during the Little Ice Age became the agricultural foundation for the Industrial Revolution. It's like being forced to learn new skills by disaster, only to discover that your new skills make you incredibly successful. The social structures that emerged from the Little Ice Age were fundamentally different from medieval European society. The old feudal hierarchies had been shattered by centuries of climate crisis. The new European societies were more mobile, more innovative, and more adaptable. The merchant classes that had developed during the climate emergency had become the dominant economic force. It's like a social revolution disguised as a climate adaptation. The technological innovations that had been developed to survive the Little Ice Age became the foundation for European global dominance. The navigation techniques that had been perfected during dangerous voyages to find new resources became the basis for global trade networks. The metallurgy that had been advanced to create better tools for harsh conditions became the foundation for industrial machinery. The climate crisis had been a technological boot camp that prepared Europe for world domination. The psychological transformation was perhaps the most profound. The Europeans who emerged from the Little Ice Age were fundamentally different from their medieval ancestors. They had internalized the lesson that prosperity was temporary, that survival required constant innovation, and that natural disasters could be turned into opportunities. This climate-forged mentality would drive European expansion, industrialization, and scientific advancement for centuries. It's like an entire civilization developing post-traumatic stress disorder that somehow makes them more successful. The urban centers that had survived the Little Ice Age were marvels of adaptation. Cities like Amsterdam, London, and Paris had been rebuilt multiple times to handle the extreme weather conditions. The infrastructure that had been developed to manage floods, ice, and extreme cold became the foundation for modern urban planning. European cities entering the 19th century were better designed and more resilient than cities anywhere else in the world. The financial systems that emerged from the Little Ice Age were revolutionary. The banking networks that had been developed to fund survival during climate disaster became the foundation for global capitalism. The insurance systems that had been created to manage weather-related risks became the basis for modern financial services. The commodity markets that had been established to trade adaptive crops became the foundation for global trade. It's like the entire modern financial system was born from climate necessity. The scientific revolution that accelerated during the Little Ice Age was driven by survival needs. The meteorology that had been developed to predict dangerous weather became the foundation for modern atmospheric science. The agricultural science that had been created to grow crops in impossible conditions became the basis for modern biology. The engineering that had been developed to manage water and ice became the foundation for modern technology. Climate disaster had forced Europeans to become better scientists. The cultural changes were equally profound. The European arts that emerged from the Little Ice Age reflected a civilization that had been hardened by centuries of struggle. The literature was more realistic, the music more emotional, the architecture more practical. The cultural productions of post-Little Ice Age Europe had a depth and intensity that reflected the trauma and triumph of climate survival. It's like an entire civilization developing artistic maturity through shared suffering. The religious transformation was remarkable. The Christianity that emerged from the Little Ice Age was more practical, more worldly, and more focused on human agency than medieval Christianity had been. The Protestant work ethic that would drive European capitalism was partly a product of climate-forced self-reliance. The scientific rationalism that would challenge traditional religious authority was partly a result of climate-driven innovation. The climate crisis had secularized European society without destroying its spiritual foundations. The military advantages that Europeans gained from the Little Ice Age were overwhelming. European armies in 1850 were disciplined, technologically advanced, and experienced in managing logistics under impossible conditions. The military techniques that had been developed to fight during harsh weather became the foundation for modern warfare. The organizational systems that had been created to manage resources during scarcity became the basis for modern military logistics. It's like the entire continent had been through military training for 5 centuries. The irony of European global dominance is that it was built on the foundation of European climate disaster. The same Little Ice Age that had nearly destroyed European civilization had also created the conditions that would allow Europe to dominate the world. The harsh climate that had killed millions of Europeans had also forged the survivors into something harder, more innovative, and more dangerous than anything that had existed before. The environmental knowledge that Europeans had gained from surviving the Little Ice Age was unprecedented. No other civilization had experienced such prolonged climate pressure and survived. The ecological understanding that had been developed to manage resources during scarcity became the foundation for modern environmental science. The climate adaptation techniques that had been created for survival became the basis for modern environmental management. Europeans had become the world's first climate experts through brutal necessity. The global networks that Europeans had established during the Little Ice Age gave them enormous advantages when the climate finally improved. The colonial territories that had been established as climate refuges became the foundation for global empires. The trade routes that had been developed to find new resources became the basis for global commerce. The technological innovations that had been created for survival became the tools for global dominance. The demographic patterns that emerged from the Little Ice Age were revolutionary. The population that had survived centuries of climate disaster was genetically and culturally selected for adaptability, innovation, and resilience. The European population of 1850 was literally the product of natural selection under extreme conditions. It's like an entire civilization had been through evolutionary pressure that made it more successful. The educational systems that had been developed during the Little Ice Age were more advanced than anything that had existed before. The literacy rates that had been driven by the need to share survival information became the foundation for modern education. The technical knowledge that had been developed to manage climate challenges became the basis for modern engineering and science education. Climate necessity had created the most educated population in world history. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Europe's emergence from the Little Ice Age was how quickly the continent forgot the lessons of climate vulnerability. Within a generation, Europeans were treating their new prosperity as permanent and inevitable. The climate trauma that had shaped their civilization was reinterpreted as evidence of European superiority rather than European luck. It's like survivors of a disaster becoming convinced that they're invincible rather than fortunate. The Europe that emerged from the Little Ice Age in 1850 was simultaneously the most successful and most dangerous civilization in human history. It had been forged by climate disaster into something harder, more innovative, and more adaptable than anything that had existed before. But it had also been shaped by centuries of scarcity into something more exploitative, more aggressive, and more willing to sacrifice others for its own survival. The Little Ice Age was over, but its legacy was just beginning. The civilization that had been nearly destroyed by climate change was about to reshape the entire world. And not everyone would benefit from the transformation. The ice had retreated, but the world it left behind was forever changed by the long winter that had nearly ended European civilization. The climate crisis that had begun as Europe's greatest disaster had become the foundation for European global dominance. The ice had finally melted, but its influence on human history was just beginning to be felt. So here we are, at the end of a story that spans 5 centuries and reshapes everything we thought we knew about human resilience. The Little Ice Age wasn't just a weather event. It was humanity's greatest unintentional experiment in adaptation, survival, and transformation. Think about it. In the space of a few generations, Europeans went from wine-making monks in Yorkshire to global empire builders. Climate change didn't just kill millions. It forged the survivors into something harder, more innovative, and more dangerous than anything that had existed before. The same ice that buried Viking settlements in Greenland also carved out the determination that would eventually build the modern world. The cruel irony is that we're living through the sequel right now. While our ancestors faced cooling temperatures and advancing ice, we're dealing with warming temperatures and rising seas. The same human ingenuity that turned frozen rivers into marketplaces and agricultural disasters into colonial empires is now being tested by a climate crisis moving in the opposite direction. What strikes me most about this story is how quickly humans forget their own vulnerability. The Europeans, who emerged from the Little Ice Age, convinced themselves that their success was inevitable rather than miraculous. They forgot that their global dominance was built on the foundation of climate disaster, not climate mastery. Maybe that's the lesson we need to remember. That civilization is always more fragile than we think, that prosperity is always more temporary than we hope, and that the climate doesn't care about our plans. but also that humans are remarkably good at turning disasters into opportunities if we're willing to abandon our assumptions and adapt to new realities. The Ice Age is over, but the age of climate change is just beginning. The question isn't whether we'll survive, it's what we'll become in the process. Thanks for taking this journey with me tonight. Sweet dreams, and try not to think too hard about what your great grandchildren will think of our current climate assumptions.